For the last 500 years, every time an empire has climbed to the top of the world, with the strongest currency, the biggest military, and a web of colonies across the globe, it has told itself the same story. This will last forever. Then it made the same familiar choices: unlimited military spending, printing more money, piling on debt, and neglecting real production in favor of power and finance. That is when the slide down begins. Golden Age Spain, the British Empire, where the sun never set, and the nuclear-armed Soviet Union seem like completely different worlds. But through an economic lens, they all moved through the same 7-stage cycle, and they all ended up in the same place: losing their reserve currency, losing the ability to fund their power structure, and falling from superpower status faster than anyone thought possible. Welcome to Crash Cycle Financial, the channel that breaks down those cycles so you can see what's waiting at the end of the road before we get there. In this video, we'll stitch together 3 collapse stories into one 7-step model, then place the United States in 2025 on that same curve. If your first reaction is, "That can't happen here," watch to the end. History almost always starts with that sentence, right before the cycle hits reality.
When most people hear the fall of an empire, they picture tanks crossing borders, capitals on fire, flags torn down from government buildings. In the real world, the end of a superpower almost never begins with an invasion. It starts with something much quieter: economic exhaustion. Long before an empire loses territory, it loses something else: the ability to pay for its own strength. It builds bases everywhere, fights must-win wars on multiple continents, and signs open-ended promises on defense, welfare, and subsidies that tax revenues can't possibly cover. Every new war, every new entitlement is sold as temporary and manageable. Stacked together, they become a bill the state cannot pay. At first, the surface still looks fine. The imperial currency is still used in global trade. Government bonds are still considered safe. The military still wins most of its battles. Citizens still receive pensions, health care, and benefits. If you only glance at the headlines, nothing seems broken. Beneath that surface, though, the plumbing changes. Defense and entitlement spending eat more and more of the budget. Governments borrow to service yesterday's promises instead of investing in tomorrow's capacity. High taxes and heavy regulations squeeze productive businesses, while the financial sector swells. The result is an economy that appears to function, but whose real productive base, the farms, factories, and innovators that actually generate wealth, is quietly shrinking. This is the silent downturn phase. Statistics can be massaged, charts can still look good, but the blood flow that keeps the imperial body alive is slowing year after year. At this point in the cycle, there are no dramatic warning sirens, no bombs falling, no borders redrawn. There is only a financial system growing more fragile, a state increasingly dependent on debt and money printing, and a society getting used to consuming more than it truly produces. That is the real beginning of imperial collapse. Our first story starts in the 1500s, when Spain was effectively the ATM of Europe. From silver and gold mines in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia, treasure fleets carried hundreds of tons of precious metal to Seville every year, turning the Spanish real into the continent's most desired coin. This financial power convinced the Spanish court its resources were inexhaustible, and that's when the dangerous cycle began. Madrid threw itself into wars on multiple fronts, fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, intervening in Italy, crushing revolts in the Netherlands, battling the English Navy, and holding far-flung territories in the Americas and Asia. By the late 1500s, military spending was swallowing roughly half of all royal revenue. Taxes could not keep up. the crown began shaving value out of each coin, cutting the silver content and replacing it with base metals, while keeping the face value unchanged. Prices surged, merchants lost trust in Spanish coinage, and inflation eroded purchasing power across the empire. To keep the wars going, the monarchy borrowed heavily from German and Italian bankers. Under Philip II alone, Spain defaulted multiple times in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, shocking Europe's financial system and marking it as an unreliable debtor. As New World silver poured in, the nobility came to see work and manufacturing as beneath them. Agriculture stagnated, industry never properly developed, and Spain imported everything from French wine to Dutch finished goods, paying with bullion that flowed right back out of the country. The economy became a pipe, not a reservoir. When silver output declined and debt piled up, living standards slid. Skilled artisans and intellectuals moved to England, France, and the Netherlands, powers that were investing in industry. Spain was left with bureaucrats, soldiers, and clergy, but too few wealth creators. A once dominant empire slid into second-tier status and never truly recovered. 3 centuries later, Britain stepped into Spain's old role as banker to the world. The pound sterling was the premier reserve currency, London the global financial hub. Most international debts were issued in sterling and cleared through the city. At its height, the empire ruled over a quarter of the world's land surface and hundreds of millions of people. That's exactly when its decline began. To police its vast holdings, Britain stationed troops from India and Africa to the Middle East and the Pacific. When World War I erupted, London chose to plunge in rather than sit it out. War spending multiplied the national debt many times over, forcing Britain to borrow heavily from the United States and flipping it from major creditor to major debtor. After the war, policymakers insisted on restoring the pre-war gold parity of the pound in 1925, even though the real economy was far weaker. An overvalued currency priced British exports out of global markets, choked industry, and entrenched high unemployment. To defend sterling, the Bank of England tightened money, further strangling domestic growth, until a full-blown crisis forced Britain off gold in 1931. Before Britain could fully recover, World War II demanded another round of total mobilization. By 1945, war loans to the US and Canada left Britain owing more abroad than its entire GDP, even as it faced the enormous cost of rebuilding at home. With finances shattered, London no longer had the money or political will to hold its empire together. India gained independence in 1947, and over the next 2 decades, decolonization swept through Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The imperial map shrank rapidly. After 1945, the dollar steadily displaced the pound as the world's primary reserve currency. Sterling limped on inside a shrinking sterling area, but repeated devaluations eroded its status. Britain kept its UN security seat and nuclear arsenal, yet the world increasingly treated it as a former great power, a museum of what global dominance used to look like. After World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as one of 2 superpowers. It possessed a massive army, a huge nuclear arsenal, and a ring of satellite states stretching from East Germany to Poland and beyond. Soviet leaders believed central planning would outperform Western capitalism and eventually bury it. Behind that confidence, the economy was slowly suffocating. To match the US tank for tank, missile for missile, and to counter American influence in the developing world, Moscow poured an estimated 15 to 20% of GDP into defense, roughly double America's peacetime share. It funded interventions in Afghanistan, propped up regimes in Cuba, Syria, Vietnam, Angola, and elsewhere. Each commitment added weight to an already overloaded system. By the 1970s, industrial and agricultural growth had slowed to a crawl. Collectivized farms underperformed so badly that the USSR, despite its fertile land, had to import tens of millions of tons of grain every year from the US and Canada. Factories churned out low-quality goods, innovation lagged, and consumers faced chronic shortages. The ruble couldn't be freely exchanged abroad, and few outside the bloc wanted it. Even Soviet citizens preferred hard currency whenever they could get it. To pay for imported food, machinery, and technology, the government relied on gold and, above all, oil and gas exports, its only reliable sources of real money. When global oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, that lifeline frayed. Economic strain undermined Moscow's grip over Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and within a year, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other states had broken away. The Soviet Union lost both its strategic buffer zone and crucial economic partners. By the early 1990s, the states simply lacked the cash to pay the army or keep the bureaucracy functioning. Inflation surged, the ruble collapsed, and the Union's republics declared independence one by one. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, a heavily armed superpower undone not by invasion but by internal economic failure. Today, the United States maintains roughly 750 bases in around 80 countries and a security presence in more than 150. Annual defense spending, at about $850 billion, exceeds that of the next several nations combined. Washington is simultaneously committed to defending Europe through NATO, backing allies in East Asia, and managing crises in the Middle East, a deployment map no previous empire has ever matched. In 1971, the U.S. closed the gold window, turning the dollar into a pure fiat currency. Since the early 2000s, and especially after the global financial crisis and the pandemic, the money supply has expanded dramatically as trillions of new dollars entered the system. The mechanics differ from Spain's clipped coins or Britain's overvalued gold peg, but the logic is similar. Use monetary power to cover spending far beyond tax revenues. By late 2024, federal debt had climbed to roughly $36 trillion and continues rising. Projections show annual interest payments crossing the $1 trillion mark within a few years, rivaling or even surpassing defense spending. When a government borrows just to pay interest on old borrowing, it has entered a classic debt spiral. The U.S. still innovates and designs, but much of the physical production has moved overseas. The country runs an annual trade deficit on the order of $800 billion, relying on foreign factories for electronics, pharmaceuticals, key industrial components, including parts used in its own weapon systems. Like Spain during the Silver Age, America increasingly imports what it consumes while exporting its currency. Domestically, trust in institutions sits near historic lows. Political polarization is intense. Homelessness and urban crime are persistent issues in many cities, and deaths linked to drugs still claim tens of thousands of lives each year, despite some recent improvement. Fertility has dropped below replacement, and a growing share of citizens believe the system no longer works for them. These are classic signs of social decay seen in past empires entering the late stages of the cycle. Taken together, these 5 stages place the United States deep into the historical pattern, at roughly the same point where earlier superpowers began sliding toward the final 2 phases. The next step in the pattern is when the world quietly reduces its dependence on the empire's currency. For the US, the hints are already there. Major economies experimenting with settling trade in their own currencies, blocs like BRICS exploring alternative payment systems, and central banks diversifying reserves by adding more gold instead of only treasuries. The dollar is still dominant, but the once unquestioned trust is giving way to hedging and contingency planning. For past empires, this phase looked like the first hairline crack in a concrete dam, small but impossible to ignore. If there is no serious reset in fiscal policy, monetary discipline, and productive capacity, history suggests pressure eventually converges into a single breaking point, a currency crisis, a debt crisis, and a political crisis unfolding almost at the same time. The currency slides, borrowing costs spike, and governments are forced into brutal choices between default, austerity, or aggressive money printing. For ordinary people, this doesn't show up first in bond spreadsheets. It hits through inflation, job losses, and collapsing paper wealth. The timeline is unknowable, but once the first 5 stages are locked in, previous empires have found it very hard to step off the track. The 3 empires in our story all completed these 7 stages without ever believing they could actually fall, until the day the cycle finished. The question for the United States is no longer, could this happen? But at which stage do we decide to change course? If you want to keep decoding these repeating patterns and understand how they affect your savings, your career, and your future, hit subscribe to Crash Cycle Financial. History has already written the script. Our job is to read it before we reach the final scene.